So for those of you new to the Seekers Forum, this introductory session is an opportunity to become acquainted with the program that we're going to be doing together for the next 8 weeks. And it will be followed, my remarks will be followed by 20 minutes writing to a prompt, and then we will have time for questions and answers and conversation. So in our last program, we were looking at the enigma of self-love and ways to practice loving kindness and unconditional friendliness toward ourselves. Recognizing your essential goodness and your innate potential for awakening is the departure point for any authentic spiritual practice that I know of. The original injunction of philosophy, to know yourself, must include self-love. It's impossible to know yourself without tolerating personal imperfections, learning to live peaceably inside your own skin, and ending the war within yourself in order not to add to the sufferings and complications of the world. Now, like everything human, this is an ongoing, irregular, imperfect business. It's a lifelong practice of self-fellowship. In our March-April program, we're going to be turning our attention now to how this imperfect, necessary practice of fellowship extends to the people around us and how we cultivate and maintain deep emotional relationships. The poet W.H. Auden instructs us to, quote, love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart, unquote. He's reminding us that if perfection were the price of admission to loving relationships, all of us would be alone. But of course, this isn't the case, fortunately. In fact, the opposite turns out to be true. Familiarizing yourself with your own imperfections actually makes it easier to connect with others and to tolerate their flaws and blind spots. You could say that imperfection in ourselves and others is the sand in the oyster of consciousness that seeds the pearl of deep connection. Now, I'm not saying that we ought to seek out difficulty on the path of love, but we do come to recognize that the flaws, the inconsistencies, the crookedness of our human nature actually deepens and gives texture to relationship. And it also reveals the spiritual purpose of emotional intimacy, which is to strip us of egotistical artifice and invite us to be with others as we are. Most of us long for this kind of exposure and tenderness. We realize that few things are more gratifying or pleasurable than being seen for who we are and knowing that we're loved because of our imperfections, not in spite of them. Being seen and not rejected by others brings a profound sense of relaxation and comfort. And these feelings are linked to what we associate with belonging. To belong is to be a person in progress among other such persons, an incomplete, struggling heart in the company of others who are also on the path of love. Connecting in this way helps to reduce our shame, our self-consciousness, our self-judgment, and our resistance, and also helps us open ourselves to touching and being touched. Emotional and physical touch kindle the warmth in us that we need as fuel to inspire us and propel us through our difficult, uncertain lives. To be seen and touched intentionally by other souls also passing through this mysterious world. According to the psychologist William James, touch is the alpha and the omega of human affection. We need one another's emotional and physical touch desperately, and when it's lacking, as we all know, our lives are diminished. More and more people today are reporting feeling lonely and isolated in our virtually connected age. 20% of U.S. adults in Gallup's most recent quarterly data report talked about feeling loneliness most of every day. This alarming statistic is a testament to the ways in which technology, media saturation, the breakdown of family and community structures are all helping to sunder the emotional bonds between us and leave us stranded in our individual silos. And this is also contributing to the spiritual alienation that is rampant all around us. One important reason for this malaise, this spiritual malaise is the fact that our collective brains haven't yet caught up to the amount of boggling information that we're asked to take in on a daily basis. The 24-hour news cycle has largely outstripped our emotional defenses, and it leaves us in a state not of quiet desperation, as Thoreau famously described the average man's mental state in 19th century New England, but instead one of panicked, often overwhelming anxiety and atomization. As you and I consider our human future together and we look on the horizon, we see a range of daunting possibilities, from the rise of AI to nuclear threats, climate change, fascism, mass migration, superbugs, including COVID-19. All of these threats are leading us to ask ourselves how we're going to survive, and if we do, who will be there with us? It's a little bit like being in an overcrowded lifeboat with people being thrown overboard all around us and wondering who will be next. And we wonder why we feel so anxious, so cut off and breathless, so increasingly isolated. It's because we're carrying a common cultural virus. And how we do so, how we manage to carry this malaise, this spiritual virus of alienation, largely depends on the quality of our personal relationships, our deep emotional connections, which are the only things really powerful enough to buoy us through times of great turmoil. So knowing how important relationships are, particularly in dangerous times, it really is a wonder that we let ourselves become so isolated from other people and deceive ourselves into believing that we are fundamentally separate. Now, part of the reason this separateness happens in the mind is due to an optical illusion. Because our physical bodies are separate, we imagine that who we are is separate as well, that our essence is separate from the essence of others, even though our bodies themselves are composed of identical elements. Since our eyes tell us that we are disconnected, we live, many of us, most of us, with the illusion that we are alone and that we are separate. And this story creates the psychological gap that we then spend our lives trying to cross. So in other words, we create the gap with our minds, the imaginary separation between us, and then we struggle to work our way back across this gap, also using our dualistic minds. According to perennial philosophy, this game is part of the Leela, the spiritual play of the universe, in which consciousness, or God, if you like, hurls itself away from itself in order to work its way back to union. As emotional creatures in relationship, we're engaged in a similar process, imagining ourselves separate from others in order to work our way back to connection. The human body is aware that it lives in the world with others of the same kind, but the mind weaves fantasies of cosmic aloneness and existential angst. In order for emotional intimacy to take place, the mind must first be shown the error of its ways. And that's what we are doing in the Seekers Forum. That's why we're doing this program. It's in order to challenge the psychological illusion of separation, alienation, entrapment in the lonely me through the practice of self-inquiry and reflection on what is real. Now, there are myriad ways of doing this practice, crossing the imaginary gap between us and other people. But for our purposes in the Seekers Forum, I'd like to suggest writing as an unsurpassed method for clearing away unwanted division narratives and facilitating deep connection. That's why for this program's practice challenge, I've created a practice of writing letters to people that you care about in order to clarify obstacles or misunderstandings between you and rekindle the warmth, the touch, the feeling of belonging that may be obstructed by unsaid things. As I'll point out in the instructions, there's no need to send these letters. That's not what it's about. This is an inside job. But it's very likely that you'll find, if you decide to do this practice challenge with us, that writing truthful letters is informative and therapeutic, regardless of what happens between you and the other person. So even when there's no outward change in the relationship, your choice to address the obstacles to intimacy and to make way for interpersonal connection really can have profound beneficial internal results. So when we practice viewing relationship as a spiritual practice, as a path of self-awareness, healing, freedom, expression, love, it changes the stakes, and it also changes the meaning of the game, the meaning of relationships in our lives. You come to recognize that connection itself is sacred. Touch is sacred. Belonging is sacred. Transcending the ego to put others first is sacred. Sharing the travails and joys of this world with others is itself a sacramental act. Opening to relationship as a spiritual endeavor turns connection into sadhana, a practice for awakening. You come to view the people that you care about as souls against an internal backdrop, as mysteries, just like you are, mysteries that are wholly unique and impermanent in this mysterious cosmos. Just think of how differently we might treat one another if we saw through this spiritual lens. Can you imagine the beauty and the kindness that we might show one another in such a sacred world? We wouldn't waste each other's love or define people by their worst mistakes or characteristics. Because, of course, what we focus on increases. And knowing this, in this sacred world, we would emphasize the good and the beautiful without denying the shadow. We would see one another as compatriots on the path, not as potential enemies or presumed enemies. But this, of course, is the antithesis of what we see around us. In a culture that's focused on our basest instincts, on lack of forgiveness, on sinking to our lowest denominator, on cynicism, materialism, greed, and power. The ethos of the jungle prevails, and relationships can easily become transactional. We've started to question sincerity and to encourage distrust. And that's why it's so imperative that we resist the temptation to follow suit. Disconnection produces enormous despair. We lose sight of the soul, and we can easily get trapped in the shadows of neurosis and personality. Focusing on the negative qualities of humans, failing to recognize the beauty and the possibility of other people, failing to lift each other up, produces terrible soul sickness. And that's how many of us are feeling today, sickened by the loss of fellow feeling in our culture. While there's more than enough blame to go around, surrendering to pessimism sinks the spirit for all of us, and it can cause a kind of spiritual blindness to set in. A blindness to the good and the beautiful. Blindness to what's true beyond the doom-saying negative mind. Blindness to the possibility of healing, which only increases with patience and attention. Blindness to harmony, to interdependence, to the natural ease of being with other people. Blindness to the soul of the other, hidden in their crooked hearts. And blindness to our shared good fortune in having the opportunity to share this brief, precious existence at all. When relationship becomes a calling, it manifests as grace. I've seen this many times in my life, and recently with a very dear friend of mine. She's an unusually loving, open, bright soul. She's also a very wise woman. And after she divorced her husband of almost 40 years, she met a man when she was in her late 60s. They both were. And he was a lovely man, perfectly nice guy with a good but wounded heart, but somebody who was also stuck in the past. He was quite self-defensive and moody. And it was amazing to see my friend turn this relationship into a spiritual practice. She was honest with him. She was radically truthful with him, but she was also consistently supportive. She saw him as a soul. She gave him a chance. She did everything she could to help him toward his healing and to help him hold a vision of himself as a happier guy, as a happier and more available guy. And now, 5 years later, they're happily married, and I've seen the best of this person come out of its shell. For me, it has been evidence close up of what love as a spiritual practice can actually do in the context of relationship. My friend's husband says that he was blind and now he sees. And this has only happened because my friend was able to transcend her self-defensive, judgmental responses, practice seeing him as a soul, and stay rooted in her own wisdom as he moved through his own healing process. Now, this is very hard work, and there were many times that she was challenged, but in the end, love prevailed, which is what love can do when it abides, when it keeps its eyes open, and when it maintains a vision of what is possible when the goodness of the other person is allowed to come to the fore. So let me just share a few rules of the road that I've picked up after many decades of mistakes and struggling and doubting in relationships, and how to bring spiritual awareness into our deep bonds. Being a spiritual seeker presents particular challenges when it comes to relating to other people, including not looking down on folks who don't have an explicit spiritual practice. That was something that in the beginning of my own sadhana, my own development, I had to become aware of, was that in the name of wanting enlightenment for all, I was judging people who were doing it their own way. And that was a real humbling for me. And it was a great lesson. And that's something as spiritual practitioners that we need to always be aware of, not turn our own spirituality into an ego trip. So here are a few lessons from the road that I've picked up that could be useful. The first is, as I was saying, to see the other person as a soul. And this is hard, particularly with people that we see a lot, to remember their transcendental nature, to realize that they are and will forever be a mystery, rather than labeling, reducing, containing, judging, and discarding, which is what the ego wants to do when it encounters imperfection. The next point is to cultivate the ability to be alone. As most of us know, it's extremely important to be able to practice self-reliance, to not make others responsible for our happiness, and recognize that, of course, dependency and attachment are part of real life. They're part of any human relationship, but it's a matter of degree. Particularly if you're financially dependent on another person, this can get very tricky, and I recommend being attuned to how you may be compromising your own behavior and authenticity in order to feel safe with that person's financial support. The next is to honor the self-sovereignty of the other person, and that comes with seeing them as a soul. To recognize that regardless of the nature of your relationship, this person is free. You cannot control them. You're not meant to control them. And that when we lose that sense of the sovereignty of the other, all kinds of abuses can start to take place, including a loss of respect. So we need to stick up for our own self-sovereignty, and also in relationship to remember that quality of freedom in the other person and to honor it. The next point is to tell the emotional truth. And of course, this is a touch and go business. It's a case-by-case practice. This isn't about blasting people with our emotional truth at every opportunity. It's about recognizing when the truth needs to be told, and when those moments come up, not missing them. I have a theory that when we miss those moments of emotional truth, that really is what begins to pull intimacy apart and also increase distrust. So as much as you're possible, in whatever way works for you, including writing letters, which I highly recommend, tell the emotional truth with as little shame and cover up as possible. The next is to listen carefully. We have forgotten as a culture largely how to listen carefully to another person, to be present for them, to witness them without distortion, and know that they can speak their truth to us without being rejected. This is an integral part of any kind of deep, loving relationship, cultivating the capacity to listen and not feel the need to interject or control, manipulate, or shut other people down for having feelings that we may perhaps find threatening or uncomfortable. The next rule of the road is to drop perfectionism. Perfectionism is the voice of the oppressor, as Annie Lamott likes to say. Perfectionism is one of our greatest foes, and nowhere more so than in our relationships with other people. So knowing ourselves to be utterly and forever imperfect, on a relative level, we can accept the imperfection of the other, and that has a wonderful humbling effect. It brings you down to size. It knocks you off your pedestal. And you stop looking for an ideal other that doesn't exist and punishing the people in your life for not living up to those ideals. This is very, very important. The next is something that I've learned recently, actually, which is to soften our story about other people. Soften the story. Realize the story is a creation of your own mind, that it can be changed. It's not definitive. For example, if you're in a relationship with someone you've known for a very long time who feels unavailable to you, you could change the story from why aren't they more available to isn't it nice we're still in touch? You hear the difference? One is gratitude, one is humility, one is sincerity, and the other is judgment and clinging, grabbing, and feeling like the other person is somehow letting us down. So softening our stories, whatever they happen to be, because of course every relationship itself becomes a story. So understanding the nature of the narrative between yourself and another person is integral to healing that narrative and making it more beneficial for both of you. The next is to have a sense of humor. We have to keep laughing at ourselves and other people. The expression Menschen tracht und Gott lacht, man thinks and God laughs. Well, that's nowhere more true than in relationships where we try to think our feelings, we attempt to control through our seriousness and our cogitation. But of course, humor explodes all of that. And we do know that it's those people we feel the most intimate with whom we can be the most relaxed and let our hair down. The next is to remember to abide through conflict. This is very, very important for anyone who has ever had the desire to flee when the going gets rough, or to play a kind of avoidance game to feel safe or protect oneself in relationship. A key piece of intimacy is knowing the other person isn't going to bail when you are hurting, no matter the nature of the relationship. So remember, so cultivate the ability and the willingness to abide through conflict. Love abides. That's one of its primary characteristics. The next rule of the road is to share desires. Nothing keeps relationship alive more than sharing desires in things that are bigger than the relationship. Beauty, art, culture, service, spirituality, whatever, intellectual pursuits, artistic and creative pursuits, share desires, pool your passions. That only makes experience richer in all kinds of different relationships. The next is to make space for the shadow. We have to make space for the shadow, which goes along with accepting imperfection, but recognizing that we all have our off-limits places, the dark side of the moon, the parts of ourselves we may not reveal right away, but are there nonetheless. The shadow, as you know, is where we hide not only the things that we're ashamed of, but also some of our greatest strengths, our originality, our passions. So allow for the shadow of the other person to reveal itself. And when it rears its ugly head, don't be so surprised. Big surprise. Pettiness, big surprise envy, big surprise jealousy, big surprise competition. All of it human. And the final rule for the road I would like to suggest has to do with shame and being shameless. I have seen in my own life that the ability to be shameless in relationship, and I'm not talking about not having moral shame. I'm talking about the kind of toxic shame that inhibits us, that keeps us small, that keeps us strangers from one another. To be as shameless as possible with the people you love. Hide as little of your crookedness as possible from the people that you love. And if they truly love you, if there's a foundation of trust between you, it will only deepen the caring and the affection between you. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about relationships as the beginning of our March-April program. And now we'll do 20 minutes of writing. Here we go. I'd like you now, please, to take 20 minutes to write about when you tend to get tripped up or triggered in deep emotional relationships. Right? When do you tend to get tripped up or triggered in deep emotional relationships, and why? The why is very important. Be as specific as you can be, please. We'll take 20 minutes to do this writing. 10 minutes in, Jay will open up the breakout room if you would like to join some other members and chat. Otherwise, just keep on writing. 20 minutes.